When Richard Sterling decided to deny his own son in front of his family and corporate attorneys, he genuinely believed he was protecting his heritage, his immense wealth, and the commercial empire he had spent 15 painstaking years building in Chicago. On that damp autumn afternoon in the downtown high-rise, Sarah Mitchell walked out of that mahogany-paneled boardroom holding 4-year-old Toby's small hand without raising her voice, without shedding a single pleading tear, and without begging anyone in that opulent room to believe her truth. Years slipped quietly past, turning into nearly a decade of ruthless corporate conquests, and Richard continued living his life as though that quiet little boy were merely an old, inconsequential clerical error that had dissolved into thin air. But on an unseasonably chilly Monday morning in the heart of the Chicago financial district, the executive board of Sterling Enterprises received an urgent notice that an elusive private group had quietly accumulated enough equity to seize decisive control of the enterprise. When Richard pushed through the double-frosted glass doors expecting to confront a ruthless foreign hedge fund manager, he froze at the threshold as he saw 12-year-old Toby sitting composed at the very head of the boardroom table, tall enough and steady enough to look directly into the eyes of the powerful man who had once signed away his existence. The heavy oak boardroom door had barely clicked shut behind them 8 years earlier, when the senior family attorney leaned over Richard's right shoulder, whispering in a low, measured voice that signing the document would permanently terminate all voluntary paternal claims, leaving Sarah with only the cold courts if she chose to fight. Richard had hesitated for a single heartbeat, his fountain pen hovering half an inch above the crisp parchment, while across the polished glass table Sarah gently wrapped her slender fingers over Toby's small knuckles. The boy was only 4 years old then, clad in a second-hand blue fleece jacket, completely unable to comprehend why the wealthy adults in tailored suits were looking through him as if he were made of glass, sensing only the trembling firmness in his mother's grip. "I didn't bring my son here to ask for your money, Richard," Sarah had stated with chilling calm, but Richard had kept his eyes fixed firmly on the contract, muttering that everyone always claimed money wasn't the motive right before they demanded a trust fund. Sarah had let out a soft, humorless breath, remarking on how tragic it was that the moment he became profoundly wealthy, he immediately convinced himself that every human being stepping into his orbit was only trying to carve away a piece of his fortune. Richard's formidable mother, Eleanor Sterling, adjusted the antique pearl necklace at her throat and leaned forward with a sharp, practiced smile, assuring Sarah that nobody was directly accusing her of anything untoward. Sarah slowly turned her head toward the older matriarch, asking with quiet dignity which other family could have possibly summoned them to a 36th-floor legal suite simply to demand why an innocent child existed. Little Toby looked up into his mother's face, his voice cutting clearly through the suffocating tension as he asked if they were finally going home, a question that made Richard look up involuntarily. Richard found himself staring at the boy's dark, wavy hair, the distinctive line of his square jaw, and the subtle habit of pressing his lips tightly together when anxious, all of which mirrored the faded childhood photographs Eleanor proudly kept in silver frames across her suburban estate. Richard caught the undeniable resemblance, his pulse quickening in his throat before he abruptly looked away, an involuntary reaction that Sarah did not miss for a single second. The family attorney smoothly slid the settlement document forward by 3 inches, and within less than 10 seconds, Richard's signature was scrawled at the bottom, the very same elegant, sweeping penmanship that closed multi-million-dollar acquisitions used on that morning to erase a 4-year-old boy. Sarah knelt down on the plush carpet, calmly pulled the zipper of Toby's jacket all the way to his chin, and led him toward the heavy door, turning back just once to tell Richard to remember that day. Because one day he would have to look his son in the eye without lawyers or his mother whispering in his ear. And when that day arrived, he had better not dare ask why the boy called him a stranger. Eleanor waited until the latch clicked shut, before letting out a slow, calculated sigh, reassuring her son that he had made the only sensible choice for the future of their family legacy. Richard remained seated in silence for nearly a minute, his gaze lingering on the empty leather chair where the little boy had sat swinging his legs, before asking his mother whether she had actually conducted the private DNA test she had promised to arrange through her private clinic. Eleanor's eyes drifted away for a fraction of a second as she dismissed the question, claiming that the woman's history spoke for itself and that spending private resources on an obvious opportunist was an insult to their name. Richard pressed the matter with sudden sharpness, asking directly whether the test had been completed, but Eleanor merely unclasped her designer handbag, reminding him that the Japanese investment delegation was waiting on the 40th floor, and that running the company was what he was actually born to do. For the next 8 years, Richard did precisely that, burying himself in aggressive expansions, luxury developments, and quarterly balance sheets, pretending that the silence in his personal life was simply the natural price of corporate greatness. At 20 minutes past 7 on an overcast Monday morning, Richard Sterling strode through the gleaming limestone lobby of the Sterling Tower on Michigan Avenue, moving with the careless speed of a man who believed the entire concrete city belonged to him. The Sterling name was etched in brushed steel behind the concierge desk, emblazoned across glossy investor prospectuses and prominently displayed on the brass plaques of the charitable foundation Eleanor managed, where framed photographs of smiling, underprivileged children lined the immaculate walls. Richard despised tardiness, and because an unexpected delay on the expressway had made him 3 minutes late, his expression was colder than usual as the building's security guard swiped him through the private executive turnstiles. The elevator doors had barely closed on the private express lift when Marcus Vance, the chief financial officer and Richard's closest confidant since their college days at Northwestern University, called his personal phone in a state of visible agitation. Marcus urged him not to go to his personal office and instead proceed straight to the central boardroom, explaining that an unscheduled hostile maneuver had completely derailed the morning schedule. Richard stepped off onto the executive floor, his brow furrowed in irritation, demanding to know why their scheduled 8 o'clock meeting regarding the suburban real estate expansion was being abruptly canceled. Marcus was waiting right outside the elevator vestibule, holding 2 ringing smartphones in his left hand, his silk tie slightly askew as he revealed that an unknown entity had quietly executed massive market purchases over the weekend. Richard scoffed, walking swiftly down the hallway as he pointed out that nobody could easily challenge their 35% voting bloc without triggering immediate regulatory alarms. Marcus stopped him in his tracks, revealing that the mysterious buyer had already secured 29% of the company's common shares by dawn and had simultaneously obtained irrevocable voting proxies from 6 key minority shareholders who had previously pledged their loyalty to the Sterling family. Among those who had sold their positions was Arthur Pendleton, a longtime family friend and founding board member who had personally looked Richard in the eye the previous month and sworn on his life that his shares were not for sale at any price. When Richard pushed open the double doors of the boardroom, 5 senior directors were already seated in hushed conversation, with Eleanor occupying her usual place near the head of the table, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. Marcus connected his laptop to the large wall display, projecting the corporate profile of the acquiring entity, a private Delaware entity registered simply as Mitchell Horizon Asset Management. Eleanor narrowed her eyes at the screen, murmuring that the name Mitchell was far too common to mean anything specific, but Marcus quickly advanced the presentation to outline the entity's history. The firm had emerged roughly 3 years prior, initially funding educational software platforms and adaptive mathematical learning algorithms before expanding aggressively into predictive supply chain analytics and major infrastructure funds. When Richard demanded to know the identity of the beneficial owners behind the management veil, Marcus took a heavy breath, explaining that the ultimate corporate beneficiaries were shielded beneath a private family foundation whose legal trustees were represented by top-tier securities lawyers. Richard slammed his leather portfolio onto the table, demanding names, addresses, and backgrounds rather than corporate structures, visibly outraged that an outside entity had spent months quietly buying up his family's enterprise under their very noses. Eleanor attempted to pacify the room by suggesting it was likely an institutional investment designed to extract a short-term dividend, but Marcus interrupted her with a grave expression, stating that Mitchell Horizon had just formally requisitioned an extraordinary board meeting for Thursday morning. The sole agenda item of the requested session was an immediate binding vote of no confidence to strip Richard of his executive chairmanship and replace the entire corporate leadership. Richard let out a bitter, echoing laugh, utterly refusing to believe that any rival could march into his grandfather's building, use his own governance bylaws against him, and demand that he surrender the helm of the company. He closed Marcus's laptop with a sharp snap, declaring that within the 3 days remaining before Thursday, he would personally buy back every single uncommitted share on the market, completely ignoring Eleanor's quiet, uneasy warning that some things in life were simply not for sale. Across the city in a quiet, sunlit neighborhood in Evanston, Sarah Mitchell was standing at the kitchen stove flipping grilled cheese sandwiches in a cast-iron skillet when 12-year-old Toby walked in wearing gray wool socks. Toby casually pointed out that a thin wisp of white smoke was beginning to rise from the edges of the pan, prompting Sarah to laugh softly, switch off the burner, and set the golden-brown sandwich onto a ceramic plate before him. Toby was tall for 12, inheriting his father's dark hair that constantly fell across his forehead, but possessed an unnerving photographic memory for complex numerical patterns and a quiet, observant disposition that often caught his schoolteachers off guard. As he took a bite, Toby casually mentioned that he had seen an incoming legal notification on Sarah's tablet that morning, causing Sarah's hands to pause on the granite countertop as she gently reminded him for the 400th time not to monitor adult correspondence. Toby offered a faint, lopsided smirk, pointing out that the corporate presentation had been left wide open on the dining room table, revealing that the decisive shareholder vote was scheduled for Thursday morning. Sarah sat down across from her son, studying the quiet intelligence in his dark eyes, and asked him what else he had gathered from the documents, to which Toby replied that the board still had no idea who was truly behind the acquisition. Toby leaned forward, asking his mother a question that had lingered beneath the surface of their quiet life. Why she had chosen to invest in Sterling Enterprises when she had always taught him that buying into poorly managed corporations was a waste of resources. Sarah looked out the kitchen window toward the autumn trees, where the golden leaves were drifting slowly across the yard, remembering the 8 long years she had spent working 70-hour weeks to build her venture consultancy from a cramped attic apartment. She had spent nearly a decade preparing for painful questions from her growing boy, yet Toby rarely asked about the father who had abandoned him until this very morning when he looked at her and asked whether the man in the glass tower even knew he existed. Sarah turned her gaze back to her son, her voice softening as she answered that Richard had known about him when he was 4 years old, but that they had chosen to build a beautiful, independent life on their own terms. Toby bit the inside of his cheek, a subtle, nervous reflex that had belonged to his father's bloodline for generations, and asked whether Richard would recognize his name if it appeared on the formal registry on Thursday. Sarah admitted that she could not predict how Richard would react, But before Toby picked up his backpack for school, he looked back at the front doorway and quietly asked his mother not to lie if Richard asked about him during the meeting. Meanwhile, back at the corporate headquarters, Richard spent his entire morning on the phone attempting to aggressively purchase back the minority shareholder votes, only to be met with polite refusals, stalling tactics, and exorbitant price demands from former allies. Frustrated and exhausted by mid-afternoon, Richard began digging into the digital history of Mitchell Horizon, stumbling across an archived photograph from a philanthropic technology gala held in Boston 2 years prior. In the background of the image, standing beside a podium, was Sarah Mitchell, her hair cut into an elegant shoulder-length bob, her posture radiating quiet authority and self-assurance. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the screen, instantly summoning Marcus back to his office and pointing at the enlarged photograph, demanding to know everything Sarah had done over the preceding 8 years. When Marcus realized who Sarah was, he stood frozen in the center of the office, reminding Richard that while he was now desperately seeking information about her, he had intentionally spent 8 years pretending neither she nor the child existed. Richard lashed out defensively, claiming that this was strictly about protecting the enterprise from a corporate takeover. But Marcus quietly remarked that the boy would now be 12 years old before stepping out into the corridor. That evening, Eleanor Sterling sat alone in the library of her suburban home, opening a concealed wall safe behind a row of hardcover books to reveal an aged, yellowed envelope bearing the seal of a private diagnostics lab. When Richard called her phone demanding to know if she had known Sarah was behind the investment group, Eleanor remained guarded, warning her son not to drag the memory of that boy into a corporate war, an inadvertent slip of the tongue that left Richard standing in his dark penthouse, wondering what his mother was truly trying to hide. The following morning, Richard bypassed his corporate security detail and waited near the entrance of a boutique coffee shop in the Fulton Market District, where he knew Sarah was scheduled for an early breakfast meeting. When Sarah emerged from a nearby office building wearing a tailored beige trench coat, Richard stepped into her path, his voice strained as he insisted they needed to speak about the Sterling Enterprises acquisition immediately. Sarah did not break her stride, calmly stepping inside the warm cafe and ordering a black Americano before gesturing toward an empty corner table by the street window, refusing to let his presence intimidate her. Richard sat down across from her, his jaw tense as he demanded to know why she was orchestrating an aggressive proxy fight to remove him from the company his family had spent generations building. Sarah stirred her coffee slowly, looking directly into his eyes, and explained that Mitchell Horizon invested strictly where capital was misallocated and leadership was failing, completely dismissing his accusation that she had mobilized tens of millions of dollars merely to seek personal revenge. When Richard leaned in and quietly asked about Toby, Sarah's hand paused inches from her cup, her expression hardening as she instructed him never to use their son's name as leverage in a corporate negotiation. Richard pressed further, his voice cracking slightly as he asked whether Toby knew who he was and what Sarah had told him over the past 8 years of total absence. Sarah looked out at the bustling city street, replying with brutal honesty that she had simply told their son the truth, that his father had made a cold, deliberate calculation to walk away, refusing to invent romantic lies or tragic excuses for a man who lacked the courage to be a parent. When Richard claimed he had simply demanded scientific proof before accepting such a life-altering responsibility, Sarah let out a bitter, incredulous laugh, revealing that she had fully cooperated with the private laboratory testing arranged by his mother 8 years prior. Richard went pale, realizing for the first time that Sarah believed he had received the genetic confirmation, prompting Sarah to urge him to ask his mother why the definitive results were never placed on his desk before she left the exact change for her coffee, and walked out into the crisp morning air. Richard drove directly to his mother's suburban residence, entering through the grand front foyer without knocking and confronting Eleanor while she was having lunch in the conservatory. When he demanded to see the original records from the private diagnostics clinic, Eleanor attempted to evade the confrontation, claiming the past was irrelevant and that she had only acted to protect his future during the high-stakes merger that established their modern corporate dominance. Refusing to accept her deflections, Richard walked into the private study, demanding the combination to the wall safe until Eleanor finally surrendered the digits under the weight of his furious realization. Richard opened the heavy steel door, pulled out the weathered folder, and stared in stunned silence at the formal genetic report. A 99.9% biological certainty that Toby was his son. For several agonizing seconds, Richard could barely draw breath, turning toward his mother in disbelief as Eleanor coldly defended her actions, reminding him that on the day he signed the legal waiver, he was terrified of losing his corporate standing and had willingly allowed her to make the convenient choice for him. Before the argument could escalate further, Marcus called Richard's mobile phone with urgent news regarding their meeting with the defecting board member, Arthur Pendleton. Marcus revealed that Arthur had not sold his 6% block of shares to Sarah's primary management fund, but had instead assigned his full voting rights to an independent technology holding company named Apex Dynamics. When Richard demanded to know who controlled Apex Dynamics, Marcus hesitated on the line, explaining that the entity was an asset management trust created specifically for a minor whose sole beneficial owner was 12-year-old Toby Mitchell. The foundational capital of the trust had originated 3 years earlier from a patented algorithmic logic system that Toby had developed as a gifted 9-year-old student, which Sarah had legally registered and licensed to major educational and logistics networks. Richard sank into a leather armchair in his mother's study, staring at the genetic report in his trembling hands, suddenly realizing that the extraordinary young mind, now holding the decisive balance of power in his corporate empire, was the very child he had discarded in a boardroom 8 years ago. On Wednesday evening, the Mitchell home in Evanston was quiet, except for the rustle of printed financial statements spread across the living room carpet, where Toby sat cross-legged, analyzing the quarterly filings of Sterling Enterprises. When Sarah returned home from her legal team's final strategy session, she found her son highlighting a specific line item in the prospectus concerning a proposed $40 million acquisition of an over-leveraged regional logistics firm. Toby looked up at his mother, pointing out that Richard's planned acquisition would dangerously deplete the company's cash reserves at a moment when their core urban commercial projects were already facing significant operational delays. Sarah sat down beside him on the sofa, amazed once again by the boy's natural financial acumen, acknowledging that her senior analysts had reached the exact same conclusion after weeks of exhaustive research. Toby set his papers aside and asked his mother if Richard would attempt to stop the shareholder vote, admitting that he had agreed to attend the meeting not out of anger, but because he wanted to see the man who had valued a corporate title over his own family. Sarah gently reminded Toby that he was under no obligation to face the Sterling family in person, but Toby insisted that since the trust held his name and his intellectual property, he deserved to sit at the table where adult decisions were being finalized. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard sat in the empty dining room of a private downtown club with Arthur Pendleton, attempting to understand why his oldest ally had chosen to cast his lot with Sarah's coalition. Arthur set his coffee cup down, looking at Richard with the weary candor of a man in his 70s, explaining that while Richard's offer was merely about paying a higher price to retain personal authority, Sarah and Toby had presented a comprehensive operational plan to save the business from reckless overexpansion. Arthur noted that when he met the young boy during the preliminary asset presentation, Toby had spoken with remarkable maturity, noting that a company with operational problems could always be restructured, but a leadership team that refused to admit its flaws was doomed to fail. Richard left the club in profound silence, instructing Marcus late that evening to immediately suspend the risky logistics acquisition and desperately requesting an opportunity to speak with Toby before the morning vote took place. When Sarah received Richard's text message asking for a private conversation with their son, she relayed the request to Toby, who replied that he would only agree to speak with Richard after the shareholder assembly was officially concluded. The following morning at 9 o'clock, the central 36th floor boardroom of Sterling Enterprises was filled to capacity with corporate attorneys, institutional fund representatives, and anxious board members. Richard arrived wearing his customary dark navy suit, but his usual arrogant swagger was completely absent as he stood quietly beside his chair, watching the entrance. When the double doors swung open, Sarah entered with measured grace, accompanied by her senior legal counsel, followed closely by Toby, who was dressed in a neat dark blazer and carrying a simple spiral notebook. Richard felt the air leave his lungs as he looked at the boy in person. Watching Toby nervously adjust his jacket sleeve, a subtle gesture that mirrored Richard's own nervous habits with absolute precision. Eleanor turned completely pale as Toby took a seat beside his mother at the far end of the long conference table, her hand trembling slightly as she rested it on her pearl necklace. The meeting commenced with formal presentations, and when Richard took the floor, he surprised the entire room by speaking with unprecedented humility, openly acknowledging the operational delays and voluntarily withdrawing his proposal for the controversial logistics buyout. When the floor opened for shareholder questions, an older board member leaned forward and skeptically questioned what role a 12-year-old child was playing in such a monumental corporate governance decision. Toby calmly opened his spiral notebook, addressing the assembly in a clear, steady voice, as he explained precisely how the company's operating margins had eroded because sales teams were committing to unrealistic project timelines that ground-level contractors could never achieve. Richard looked across the table at his son with a mixture of profound pride and deep heartbreak, realizing that the brilliant boy sitting before him possessed all of the family's visionary intellect without any of its hollow arrogance. The decisive voting commenced at 11 o'clock, and within minutes, the Assembly overwhelmingly voted to cancel the logistics acquisition and approve a complete restructuring of the board's oversight authority. The final critical vote concerned Richard's retention as chief executive officer, with the initial tally resulting in an exact 50-50 deadlock among the traditional institutional investors. Just as Richard's supporters began to express quiet relief, Sarah's lead corporate attorney stood up and presented a previously unrecorded voting covenant linked to the Sterling Charitable Foundation's original endowment charter. The document, executed 6 years prior by Richard's late father, Charles Sterling, contained a specific governance clause granting protective voting rights to an independent trust if the family board ever faced severe conflicts of interest. Eleanor gasped in outrage, claiming the document was legally obsolete, but Arthur Pendleton confirmed via video conference that Charles Sterling had established the mechanism after discovering the truth about Toby's birth 2 years before his passing. Sarah quietly revealed to the stunned boardroom that Charles Sterling had privately reached out to her after uncovering Eleanor's concealed diagnostics file, wanting to ensure that his grandson's rightful legacy could never be erased by corporate maneuvering. Richard turned to his mother in profound devastation, realizing that his late father had known the truth for years and had died without ever seeing the family reconciled. When the additional shares held by Toby's trust were officially tabulated, the final vote stood at 52.4%, in favor of immediately removing Richard Sterling from his position as Chief Executive Officer. Richard stood up slowly, removed his executive security pass from his lapel, and laid it quietly on the center of the glass table, accepting the board's decision without offering a single word of legal protest or personal resentment. Eleanor stared at her son in disbelief, accusing him of surrendering his grandfather's life's work to a child. But Richard looked back at her with tired clarity, stating that he had truly lost the company 8 years earlier on the day he chose his corporate title over his own flesh and blood. After the assembly adjourned, Richard walked down the quiet hallway and gently knocked on the door of the smaller conference room where Sarah and Toby were preparing to leave. Toby looked up from the window, asking his father directly if he was angry about the outcome of the vote, to which Richard replied with absolute sincerity that he was carrying many heavy regrets, but none of them were directed at his son. Toby showed him the highlighted logistics report, explaining that he had voted against him because the business strategy was genuinely flawed, and because he did not want a man who discarded people to continue commanding hundreds of employees. Richard took a seat across from him, admitting openly that he had discovered the truth about the genetic test only 2 days prior, but refusing to use his mother's deceit as an excuse, confessing that 8 years ago he was simply too arrogant and cowardly to do what was right. Toby looked at him thoughtfully, remarking that while he was not ready to call him a father, he appreciated that Richard had finally chosen to tell the unvarnished truth. Before Richard could respond, Eleanor entered the room uninvited, her voice strained with desperation as she attempted to justify her past actions to Toby by claiming she had only acted to protect the family's social standing and wealth. Toby stood up, looked the wealthy matriarch in the eye, and quietly noted that his mother had protected him every single day of his life without ever having to pretend that an innocent person did not exist. Eleanor was left entirely speechless, the weight of her lifelong manipulations crumbling in the presence of the boy's pure, uncomplicated honesty. As Toby and Sarah gathered their belongings to leave, Toby paused at the doorway, reminding Richard that while the corporate battle was over, he would be open to having another conversation in the future if Richard truly wished to stay in touch. For the first time in his adult life, Richard stood in an empty corporate suite with no executive authority, no institutional power, and no boardroom allies, yet felt an unfamiliar sense of peace taking root within his bruised and humbled spirit. In the weeks following the historic shareholder meeting, Marcus Vance was officially confirmed as the interim chief executive officer of Sterling Enterprises, while Sarah accepted a non-executive advisory seat on the governance committee to oversee long-term structural reforms. Richard spent several months working quietly as an uncompensated consultant, assisting the external audit team in resolving complex legacy contracts from previous mergers before permanently stepping away from all corporate operations. Eleanor resigned from her philanthropic foundations and retreated into a quiet, solitary life at her suburban estate, finally forced to confront the emotional isolation that her obsession with control had created. One sunny Saturday morning, Richard drove his modest sedan to the apartment building in Evanston, carrying a simple cardboard box of old family photographs and historical books that had belonged to his father, Charles. When Toby opened the door, the boy looked at his father's casual attire, faded blue jeans and an ordinary cotton sweater, and noted with a faint, warm smile that Richard looked remarkably smaller when he wasn't standing behind an enormous mahogany desk. Sarah welcomed Richard into their home, where the living room was filled with the warm, comforting scent of fresh coffee, school textbooks, and ordinary everyday life that Richard had never experienced during his years of relentless ambition. Toby challenged his father to help prepare lunch in the kitchen, resulting in a slightly burnt batch of garlic bread that made all three of them burst into spontaneous, genuine laughter around the kitchen island. They spent the afternoon sitting on the porch talking about Toby's upcoming science fair, his fascination with aerospace engineering, and the fond memories Richard had of his own father teaching him how to fish on the quiet lakes of northern Wisconsin. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the tree-lined street, Toby walked his father down the front steps to his car, thanking him for showing up without any lawyers, corporate agendas, or grand promises. Richard looked down at his son, his heart full of quiet gratitude, promising that he would continue to show up week after week, month after month, earning his place in Toby's life one honest conversation at a time. True wealth in this human journey is never measured by the height of the glass towers we build, the balance sheets we accumulate, or the titles we print on executive stationery. We often spend the vibrant years of our youth running relentlessly after authority and validation, convincing ourselves that control is the same thing as security, and that sacrificing our nearest relationships is simply the unavoidable price of worldly success. Yet, as the autumn of life approaches and the noise of our ambitions begins to fade, we inevitably discover that the only currency that truly endures is the depth of our integrity, the courage to acknowledge our deepest mistakes, and the love we choose to nurture when no one is watching. Second chances rarely arrive wrapped in effortless forgiveness or convenient explanations. They demand that we strip away our pride, sit in the quiet discomfort of our past failings, and commit to the humble, unglamorous work of showing up consistently for the people who matter most. When an aging heart finally learns that it is far better to be accountable than to be powerful, the heavy doors of the past swing open, allowing genuine healing to take root in the most unexpected corners of our lives, and proving that it is never too late to trade a hollow empire for the priceless warmth of an honest home.